Welcome to part 4 of the Lorelai blanket. So we're now on to round 4 of our edging, this pretty Lorelai lace edging. So let's get on with that. So I've just left you in the last video. We've just done the first round of this lacy edging, the third round altogether of the blanket border, and I finished my round here on top of this US single, UK double crochet just before the corner. So we're going to go into that same stitch and make another US single, UK double. I'm just going to call it the small stitch so that I don't have to worry about keep swapping between UK and US terminology. So we're going to chain 1 and then make that little small stitch in there. Okay, and then we're going to chain 3 as we approach the corner, and we've got these 3 clusters with chain 2 spaces in between each cluster. So we're going to go into that chain 2 space and we're going to make 2 clusters in there with a chain 1 space in between. So we're going to make a cluster, chain 1, cluster, and then we're going to go into that the second stitch, into the second stitch with a cluster, chain 1, and then we're going to do cluster, chain 1, cluster in the second chain 2 space. Yeah, so we're going to make our first cluster in there. I've yarned over, insert, pull yarn through, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, go in again and pull the yarn through, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through all 3 loops. So cluster, chain 1, and then another cluster in that space. Oops. And then chain 1, and then we're going to go into that second stitch with another cluster. So all the clusters are US doubles, UK trebles. Yeah, and they're all 2 stitches all the way along the blanket on this round. Chain 1, and then we're going to do cluster, chain 1, cluster. Yeah. So this round is easier to remember than the last round. So I'm doing my second cluster in there because we're going to ignore the joins where we joined these squares together. Yeah. So we've now made those 5 clusters for the corner, and we're going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to sort out my yarn over here. And then we're going to make a little stitch on top of the little stitch again. Chain 3. 1, 2, 3. And we're going to go into that chain 2 space between the 2 clusters with a cluster, chain 2, cluster. And that's our repeat all the way around until we get to the next corner, when we'll make 5 more clusters in there. So after making my 2 clusters, I'm going to chain 3, and I'm going to put a little stitch on top of the little stitch, and then chain 3, and into the next chain 2 space between the clusters we're going to do cluster, chain 2, cluster. Chain 2, and then another cluster. And then once we've done that, chain 3, little stitch on top of the little stitch, and then we're at that join where the 2 squares join together. We're going to just chain 3, and then into the space, cluster, chain 2, cluster. chain 3 after your 2 clusters, little stitch into the little stitch, and chain 3. Into the space between the clusters, cluster, chain 2, cluster. And you're going to keep going like so all the way until we get to the next corner. So I'm just going to stay with you while I do the next, till I get to the next corner. Hopefully your blanket's nice and big. So I made 70 squares and I got 15 squares out of each 100 grams of yarn. Chain 3 after your 2 clusters, little stitch in the little stitch. So I used about between 500 and 600 grams altogether. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then into the cluster space, cluster, chain 2, cluster. And I'm at the last one before my corner. Chain 3, little stitch in the little stitch. So I'm at my second corner now. You can always pause the video if you want. So we're going to make 2 clusters into the first chain 2 space. That will be cluster, chain 1, cluster, then chain 1, cluster into the second stitch, chain 1, cluster, chain 1, cluster into the second chain space. So 5 clusters all together. So cluster, chain 1, another cluster into that chain 2 space, chain 1, and then making a cluster into the top of that second cluster from the last round. Chain 1, we make another cluster into the chain space, or the first one into this chain space, chain 1, and then a cluster, one more. So that's 2 clusters in each chain space, 1 in the second cluster, 5 all together. Yeah. And then we chain 3 and make a little stitch into the little stitch, chain 3, and repeat as we did in the last round. And then it should look like so all the way along. And I'll see you in the next video for part 5.